I'm Christy Senatori, I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission, so all the way here from Cape Cod, about 2,500 miles. And I'm here to talk to you this morning about our Cape Cod Regional Policy Plan, really framing the future for growth and development on the Cape. The Cape Cod Commission is the regional planning agency for Cape Cod. We're a land use planning and economic development agency. We also have regulatory authority. But we're not your typical government agency, and we like to think of ourselves as planners, but really more problem solvers. And we like to think of our agency as not only a planning agency, but an information agency. So the regional policy plan really sets the stage for future growth and development for the 15 communities that comprise the Cape, and also for the regulatory processes and the regulatory permitting that our agency does. So while some of you have probably been to Cape Cod, whether you've lived there or perhaps you've visited the Cape, I wanted to share some images and some background information about our region, and I just have a short video to show you now. So when we started this update process a few years ago, this is a plan that is updated typically about every 5 years. We reached out to the broader community on Cape Cod, and we hosted a series of stakeholder meetings. We reached out to hundreds of people across the Cape and really trying to get from the people who live on Cape Cod, what are the challenges that are facing our region, and what can we do about those, and how can this plan really incorporate some solutions to some of the biggest challenges. And as you can imagine, they had a myriad of challenges that they wanted to talk about. So I'm only going to cover a handful of those today. But really, a lot of what came up and what we heard back from the people of the Cape was, how can we protect our natural resources? How can we address the impacts of climate change and coastal resilience? How can we protect our infrastructure and make sure that we're improving and promoting appropriate infrastructure in the adequate locations? And how can we preserve our cultural heritage and our community character that makes the Cape so unique, while at the same time making sure that we have the ability to continue to grow and adapt, and certainly in a residential environment? So I'm going to talk a little bit about protecting our natural resources. And here you'll see from 2001 to 2011, we lost about 2,300 acres of forest cover. And 84% of that was actually due to residential development. On the Cape, we often say that our environment is our economy, but it is actually true. We have 560 miles of coastline and beaches. Everywhere on the Cape is surrounded by water. And we have a nitrogen problem that's impacting our marine estuaries and embayments. And that nitrogen in our marine estuaries and embayments is coming from on-site septic systems. So you see those areas in the very dark blue and the orange are the only areas on the Cape that actually have wastewater that's treated. Most of that nitrogen is coming from septic systems that are in our backyard. So 80% of that watershed load for nitrogen is coming from our septic system. So we have a significant infrastructure challenge. Here you'll see the assessed value per acre across the Cape, and you'll see those areas highlighted that have the highest value per acre. And if you take a look at the same map now shown in green are those areas along the coast. And that actually represents almost $29 billion worth of assessed value of property in that special flood hazard area. So we need to study and we need to find solutions to address our coastal resilience and climate change impacts that we are seeing so rapidly increasing. We have 38% of the housing on Cape Cod is actually seasonal, and these are second homes, and these range from a low of about 18% of the homes in the Upper Cape, this is in the areas of Sandwich, to a high of about 73% on the Outer Cape in the town of Truro. And what's important to note here is that we lack a diversity in housing stock as well. Over 82% of the homes on Cape Cod are single-family homes. We have very few smaller units, multifamily units, and anything that might accommodate the different life stages that we need to accommodate. What's also important to note about our housing crisis is that the median home price on the Cape is about $385,000. This is higher than the regional average and higher than the national average. But most people think of the Cape as an affluent community, but that's not actually true. Our median household income for the county is about $63,000, and in order to afford a home that's the median home price, you'd need to earn about $80,000. You can see the disparate proportions across the Cape as you move. Some of the Upper Cape towns that are more connected to Boston and other areas, there's actually a little bit more of an opportunity for home ownership rather than on the Outer Cape where most of our second homes are. And then promoting infrastructure planning is something that comes up repeatedly. And here you'll see the different types of transportation networks that we have on the Cape. Much of what came up in this discussion was the major regional multi-use paths, so different types of walking paths, and how can we make these more connected, and how can we lessen the traffic that is on our roadway networks. And what I do want to point out here, and if you've ever been to the Cape, you recognize that we have 2 vehicle bridges. The only way to access the Cape from a vehicle are through these 2 bridges. They connect all of the people coming from the mainland to the Cape and our 7 million visitors. These bridges were constructed in the 1930s. They were constructed to accommodate a vehicle from the 1930s. So these are functionally obsolete bridges that we need to address in the near future in order to maintain a healthy, vibrant community. And then lastly, preserving our character. What you'll see here shown in blue are the protected inventoried structures, the historic structures that are more than 100 years old. And what you'll see here in orange are the structures that are 100 years or older that are not protected. So these are inventoried structures, and 43% of those structures actually have no protections on them. So it was incumbent upon us as we approached the update to this regional policy plan to consider all of these challenges and determine the best way to move forward in putting some policies and procedures in place to make sure that we can accommodate additional growth and development. So while we spent a lot of time talking to stakeholders, it was important for us to take a look back at our past development patterns on the Cape. And so you'll see here, starting from the early 1900s to about 1930, there was some development. This is parcel development by decade. That development continues to increase. So from the 1930s to nearly 1960, you'll see additional development. But where that population and that growth really started to take off and boom was from the 1960s to the 1990s. And what you'll see now is the present day. So this is the parcel development that currently exists on the Cape. While we were developing, we also did a good job protecting our open space. So about 90,000 acres of Cape Cod are protected in some form or another. But what that tells you is when you put those 2 maps together, you see the parcels that are developed combined with that open space that's already protected, that leaves very little land left to be developed. So 86% of our region is currently already developed or protected. So we need to take a look at how we grow. And so the question really wasn't whether we should continue to grow. We know we will continue to grow, but it's really how we should grow and where we should grow. So the update to this regional policy plan was really taking a look at our future. While this is a 5-year plan, typically updated every 5 years, we needed to make sure that the policies we were putting in place could take us into the next century. So that's the goal behind the regional policy plan. The Cape Cod Commission's mission is actually quite simple. It's to keep a special place special. But really, it's balancing the economic progress with environmental protection. And really that's protecting our region's resources and making sure that we can focus growth in areas where we can accommodate it. So areas of centers of activity where we can accommodate additional density, where we can have additional housing units that are smaller, they're not single-family homes, and we have the appropriate infrastructure in place or it can be developed. So we created a growth policy for the county, really talking about how to focus growth in the future into these centers of activity in areas that are supported by adequate infrastructure. We also wanted to make sure that development as it continues is responsive to context. You've heard a lot about scale over the past several hours, but really that scale for us is not only on the neighborhood level and the town level, but also the regional level. And then making sure that we consider economic and community resilience as we incorporate goals and objectives into this plan. So we took a look at the Cape, and we have a number of systems on the Cape, the natural systems, the built systems, and the community systems. And our growth policy recognizes the importance of each of these systems and the need to balance the impacts and functions of these systems. They're interconnected systems, and it's difficult to look at one without considering the impacts of the other systems. So each of the systems that we came up with in this plan have their own goal, and really the natural systems, certainly what you would consider protecting and restoring the quality and function of our region's natural environment. Those built systems, making sure we protect and enhance our built environment and our infrastructure, and the community systems, really the people. How can we protect and enhance the linkages between society and between our environment and our economy? So because we are a regulatory agency, we have a series of goals and objectives that guide local planning that happens on the Cape, but also guides our regulatory review process. And so we've broken these systems down into a number of issue areas. And then each of these systems has issue areas with goals and objectives contained within. So for example, the ocean resources goal is to protect, preserve, and restore the quality and natural values and functions of our ocean resources. Under the built systems for transportation, the goal is really to promote a safe, reliable, and multimodal transportation system. And community systems for economy, it's really to promote a sustainable regional economy. And so I'm pleased that Devin Levine was actually already able to set the stage for the Cape Cod placetypes, because I'm not going to go into the detail about how these were created. But really this gave us the opportunity to look at the Cape and look at the context from a planning perspective and also a regional regulatory perspective. We were extremely excited to work with Halcyon Levine and pleased to call them a partner on this plan. And so a lot of what you'll see in these graphics and these images and designs were created as a partnership with our agency. So I'm not going to walk through all of these in detail, but you can see here each of these place type areas has a vision, starting from natural areas to those rural development areas. And while we may not love them, suburban development areas do exist on the Cape. So the vision really is how can we better integrate these areas into their surrounding neighborhoods. And those historic character areas that do provide that unique community character to the Cape, maritime areas. But what I do want to focus on is our community activity centers. This is where we spent most of our time trying to identify and define these community activity centers. So we really took a look at what do we want in these community activity centers. We know these are areas where we should be guiding potential growth and development and really redevelopment. So we're looking for community activity, amenities for residents. We're looking for a certain amount of business activity so that we can attract visitors and residents to the area. And then compact form. We're looking for a pedestrian-oriented built environment. So we did an extensive GIS analysis and using business analyst data and a lot of other data sets, and identified community activity centers across the Cape into 16 discrete areas. And I'll go into in a minute how we came up with these 16 areas. And then just rounding out the place types, industrial activity centers, these are areas where we know we have some light industry on the Cape, and so we want to make sure that we can focus this type of development in areas where it's appropriate. And then lastly, our military and transportation areas. So to identify these place types, we created a story map Several story maps actually are associated with this. They're all available on our website, and I would encourage you to take a look at them. But I'm going to just go through briefly what is included in the one where we're identifying the community activity centers. And so this is just setting the stage for identifying our areas across the Cape. Again, talking about those place types that are really defining the context from which we're doing the planning, and then looking at those community activity centers. So what you'll see here is the analysis that we did, looking at, as I mentioned, community activity, business activity, and compact form. So if it scored well in one of those areas, you'd see it represented in one color. And then what we did was layer them. So if there's an area of parcels that have good community activity and good business activity, it received another score. And then if it had all three, it received a different score. And so then we were able to take these areas, and if these were parcels that we wanted to transform, if it maybe only had one of those categories, probably wasn't a good fit for a community activity center yet, but it's likely an aspirational community activity center that will want to work with the local communities to ensure that they're defining what they would see as community activity in these areas. Those evolve areas where they may have had two of the categories and characteristics, and then those maintain areas where it had all three were where we landed with identifying those community activity centers. So when we started this plan update, it was really important for us to take a look at how we're doing. So we have not included performance measures in this plan before, but it was imperative that we do it this time. We know that we need to make sure that our development patterns and our growth and development on the Cape is responsible. And so we put all of the performance measures on the table that we thought we should be measuring, and we think we had over 100. So we said, well, that's not probably the best number to start with. So let's focus it to potentially 9 that we want to measure, and then figure out how often we want to make sure we're tracking our progress and our performance. So these are the areas where we are looking to identify and track our progress over time. And again, we've focused these into the 3 systems, those natural, built, and community systems. So for example, how are we doing at protecting habitat? How many acres of core biomap to core habitat are we protecting? Are we focusing our efforts on protecting our drinking water? And are we connecting sidewalks in these, especially in these community activity centers? Are we making sure that these are pedestrian-friendly areas? And are we decreasing nitrogen concentrations in our embayments? And are we protecting our coastal waters? And with historic resources, are we adding structures to that inventory list? And are we making sure that we are continuing to have our activity centers evolve? And how are we doing with the high-wage jobs in the area? And are we contributing to housing diversity? And then lastly, changes in floodplain development. Are we actually making an impact on potential development in these areas? And so then lastly, of course, this plan couldn't do everything, so we have a series of recommended actions that accompany this plan. And again, focusing on these 3 systems, we're really looking at additional regional plans, and we're currently moving forward with water protection planning. We are embarking on a larger regional capital and infrastructure plan currently, and we're also looking at a regional housing strategy. One that I did want to highlight in this area was decision support tools. So leveraging a lot of the data that we have, it's important for us as an information agency to make complex information and data sets available to the general public. We have an aging demographic on the Cape, we could say. And so trying to make that information as accessible to the general population that lives on the Cape is information, and it's imperative for us to do that at this time. And then because we're a regional regulatory agency, we need to take a look at our own regulations and see if there's areas where we can streamline and places where we can use information to the best of our ability to update our tools. So I'm pleased to be here this morning. I would encourage you to take a look at that plan on our website if you have an opportunity. Again, I'd like to thank Houseo Levine. Like to thank our staff at the Commission. We have an incredible staff of planners and lawyers and GIS experts. And I should also probably have said this at the beginning, but I'm not a GIS expert. I'm actually an attorney. So this has been, any other lawyers in the room? No. Not surprised. But I just want to thank you.